Hey, welcome to my office today. I've got this box here. It's just a box. It's been sitting on my floor for probably almost a year. And I mean, it's clutter. But I've learned something over the past few months that's kind of awakened me a little bit, that sometimes clutter isn't just clutter. Sometimes it's unfinished love, or sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's unfinished responsibility. And sometimes it's just a question that you haven't figured out how to answer yet. So this box has been sitting here because I couldn't answer the question. Inside it are my dad's dentist figurines. And so if you're not a dentist, they probably don't mean that much to you. But to me, this box is my dad. And so my channel recently has accidentally become a lot about clutter lately. And it's actually not clutter, but it's the emotions behind the clutter. I'm Lisa, and this is Second Peek, where we talk about midlife. I don't think most of us struggle because we don't know how to organize. I think that there's just thousands of organizing channels. There's thousands of organizing things, containers. We know how to buy baskets. We know how to label. We know how to fold towels. What we don't know, and this is what I'm struggling with, is how to decide in our hearts what we should keep and what we should release. That is hard. And recently I was in Chicago supporting the AADSM mastery course, and I've done that for several years, many times, several times a year. And this time though, the museum at the University of Illinois Dental College happened to be open. And it's always been closed. I really didn't even know they had one. Michigan has one. But I almost didn't go in it. But I'm so glad that I did. There were displays that were honoring alumni. And a couple of them were displays of dentist figurines. And then another one was beam porcelain, birds and flowers. And I learned something fascinating about it that I never knew. That the birds and flowers were porcelain fused to gold. And it's the same technique that's used for a dentist to make gold crowns, and porcelain fused to gold. And I never knew that. And I just stood there because my mom has a beautiful collection of beam porcelain, but I never knew the significance relating to dentistry. And here I've got all of my dad's dentist figurines. And my first thought when I got these from my mom was that I would give them to some of my favorite dentist clients because I can't keep them all. And I thought that sounded really generous, but every time I thought about doing it, it just didn't feel right. And I couldn't explain why. And then part of me also just wanted to keep them all wrapped up because if I looked at them, it would make me want to keep them. And so they've just been sitting here. And then when I went to that museum at the dental college at UIC, I just realized that sometimes some collections are more than collections. They're actually part of a story, and some stories deserve the right home. You know, my dad wasn't famous, and most people have never heard of him or heard his name, but in his little corner of medicine, he was pretty extraordinary. He trained in oral and maxillofacial surgery under Hugh Tilson at the University of Texas in San Antonio. And there was supposed to be 2 residents that year, and the other resident only lasted about a month because he criticized the chief. And he got apparently the bus ticket home, which was to Oklahoma for him, and nobody got to replace him. And so my dad finished that residency program alone. So think about that. Today we talk about burnout and work-life balance and overwhelm, and my dad carried an entire residency service by himself with a wife and 3 kids in a faraway place with no support from family at all. And later he practiced trauma surgery in Kingsport, Tennessee. He lectured in Germany and Tokyo and South Korea, Malaysia. He published 6 journal articles. But that's not what I remember most, of course. I remember that he always lived with a smile on his face and arms wide open. And after he died, I noticed something while we were putting together pictures for his funeral, that in picture after picture, there he was standing on a mountaintop or on a rock, and his arms were always stretched wide open smiling and always looking like he was wanting to hug the world. And that image has never left me because that's who he was. And my mom always laughs and she says that if she hadn't managed the finances, that he'd have given everything away. And honestly, I believe her, because he would barter with patients too, not because he had to, but because he wanted to preserve their dignity. And he believed there was a difference between charity and allowing someone to contribute something that they had. And one family couldn't pay, and so they paid him with 2 hogs. And I got home from kindergarten one afternoon, and there were slaughtered hogs in our garage on sawhorses. And my dad and my Uncle Dennis, who they cured them themselves. And my dad had been a butcher in college, and my Uncle Dennis was the Dean of Food Sciences at the University of Kentucky. But I actually took those pigtails to school wrapped in aluminum foil for show and tell. Only in East Tennessee, right? Does that sound like a normal childhood? But that story says everything, because he wasn't trying to become wealthy, and he was just trying to leave people with some dignity, and that's a very different goal. So back to the museum, I was just standing there looking at those figurines, and I was thinking, oh, what if these don't belong in a cardboard box or even on my shelves? Maybe they don't belong in a bunch of random dentist waiting rooms either. And I wonder if they belong where young residents who are exhausted and overwhelmed and wondering if it's worth it can hear the story behind them. And maybe the story is the actual inheritance, and it's not the porcelain that these things are made of. And that thought reminded me just of another story. Years ago, our elderly neighbor died, and she had lived in the same house for over 60 years. And she had been an attorney, I think in the late 40s and 50s, back when women just were not attorneys. And she left that career to raise her 4 kids. And at her estate sale, they discovered these beautiful tailored suits. They had matching hats and gloves and shoes and bags, and they had hardly been worn. And her children eventually donated them to the Clarence Brown Theater. And I absolutely just loved that idea, that the clothes didn't disappear. They just started telling her story to another generation. And I thought it was just a beautiful ending. And then also at that sale, though, I walked into another room and my heart kind of sank. There was beautiful white linens and wedding gifts that were still unopened, monogrammed lace and crystal and silver, and everything was just carefully protected. And the once white linens were now yellow around the edges, and the silver was tarnished, and the crystal was dusty. And she'd been saving them for a special occasion. And apparently that special occasion never came. And I left that house with 2 completely different lessons. One collection had found new life, and the other had spent decades waiting. And as Christians, I think about Psalm 145 that says, "One generation shall commend your works to another." And I noticed that it doesn't say one generation should keep every object forever. It says, tell the story, pass it on. Commending isn't the same thing as storing and keeping. And sometimes I feel like we confuse those, or at least I do. And there's another thought that I've been wrestling with, that not everything is junk. And I know that's not a popular thing to say today. We have become a culture that often talks about stuff as though it's all the same. And if it isn't useful today, just throw it away. And if it isn't bringing immediate joy, then donate it. If it doesn't fit a minimalist aesthetic, then get rid of it. And for some people, that approach, I'm sure, is incredibly freeing. But I don't think all possessions are morally equal. And there's a difference between consumerism and craftsmanship. And I think that there's a difference between just buying something because it was on sale and preserving something because generations of human hands poured beauty and skill and time into creating it. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in a home where those distinctions really mattered. My parents collected beautiful things, and it wasn't because they wanted to impress people. It was that they genuinely appreciated artistry and, fine furniture that could outlive us all, and hand-knotted silk oriental rugs that might last hundreds of years, original artwork, the beam porcelain, beautiful ceramics, things that were designed to endure and pass on. Heirloom quilts that were stitched by women whose names most people have forgotten in our family, but whose hands are still speaking through every careful little stitch. And when I walked around in San Antonio at the Art Museum and then later at the Art Institute of Chicago, I found myself just thinking about that. Museums are filled with objects, furniture, pottery, textiles, paintings, ceramics, objects made by ordinary people over the centuries. And the people are gone, but their craftsmanship is still there to teach us, and their beauty still serves us, and their work still tells a story. So that reminded me that preserving beauty is not the same thing as hoarding. And sometimes we preserve something because it represents the very best of what human beings can create. I mean, look at this. This is Italian ceramic. So sometimes we preserve something because it connects us to history or because it reminds us that beauty matters. And that isn't clutter. That's stewardship. And it's honoring the past. And so here's where I've had to really challenge myself. Appreciating beauty doesn't mean that I'm personally called to be the curator of every beautiful thing. And I think that's where I kind of got stuck, because I really appreciate craftsmanship. I love history, and I understand why these things matter. And I started believing that I needed to keep all of it. And maybe you've done that too. That inherited china, or the quilts, or the paintings, or furniture, or collections of things. And they have value, and they're beautiful, and they deserve respect, but maybe they don't all have to stay with you. Maybe honoring something isn't the same thing as owning it. I mean, what if stewardship sometimes means becoming the bridge between one generation and the next? Then I kind of thought about some other things. I've drifted a little weird, some other place. I went in my mind to my uncle's farm. And maybe some of you have heard me mention it before, but it was magical. It was full of blueberry bushes and apple orchards and strawberry fields that made me wheeze, and had a fishing pond and this mysterious pine forest. And it had goats and llamas to feed, and a pumpkin patch that thousands of kids on field trips had trekked through, and dusty roads from the tractor ride, and it had a corn maze and a barn where they sold fried pies and cider. It was awesome. It was a place where we had my son's John Deere themed birthday party when he turned 5. And eventually it was all sold, and a neighborhood replaced it. And even the land itself changed. I mean, they just leveled everything. There were no hills, there was no topography left, and the only remnants of its existence are stupid neighborhood street names like Berry Patch Lane and stuff like that. And so I found myself just desperately wanting to save pieces of it. Old windows, bee boxes, the barn doors, the signs, a feeding trough. And I imagined that I was going to use the windows as art surfaces someday, and the barn doors as sliders in my basement as doors. And the feeding trough now I surprisingly actually do use on my porch. But some things, I don't know, I was just trying to stop time, I think, trying to keep the farm alive. But no object could really do that. And So that's when I realized that there's a difference between honoring and legacy and trying to prevent loss. One moves forward and the other just keeps looking backwards. And I don't think that the answer for me is minimalism, although sometimes I think that it would be easier to just get rid of everything than to sort through it. That's why I didn't want to even open these in a way. And I don't think that the answer is keeping everything either. I think that maybe we should ask ourselves, what future is this object serving? Is it still telling a story? Is it still blessing someone? Can it bless someone? Is it still useful? Is it beautiful? Is it inspiring? Or am I asking it to do something impossible? Like to keep someone alive, or to keep a season alive, to keep childhood alive, to keep a farm alive. And objects can't do that for us. And I think that's why this box has just been sitting here. Not because I couldn't decide what shelf to put stuff on, but because I wasn't ready to ask the harder question that, what's the most loving future for this legacy? And I think I finally know. Not because I want less clutter, but because I want to do something purposeful. And I think that the figurines belong somewhere where a young resident walking through a difficult season stops and looks and hears the story of a man who finished a residency alone and bartered surgery for 2 hogs and published 6 papers and lectured around the world and lived with his arms wide open. And if that inspires one young doctor, then they'll have done more in a display case than they could do in a cardboard box on my floor or on my own shelves. And so maybe the question that I'll leave you with today is, what's sitting in a box or a closet or an attic that you've been calling clutter, when really it's a question of, is there something you're keeping because it still has purpose, or because your heart isn't ready to let it go? And sometimes the answer is to keep it. Sometimes the answer is to use it. Sometimes the answer is to give it away. And sometimes the answer is just to simply wait. Not because you're avoiding the decision, but because you're waiting on the right home. And I think that's where I've been, just waiting for the right home for these things. And maybe that's what stewardship looks like. It's not getting rid of everything or keeping everything, but maybe patiently asking God, who could this bless? And when we find that answer, then the clutter isn't just gone. A story can keep on living. Thanks for watching with me today, and let me know in the comments if anything resonates with you.